Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host, Maqbool, with you at BTV World. In the first segment of our show today, we're going to be taking a look at what is going on with reference to the developing situation with regards to Syria. And of course, we've seen that the end of a very long war in the country has, of course, pointed towards more concerns with regards to the future and where the current scenario in Syria lies. And we've seen that because there were a lot of international elements within this conversation, it is very, very important to also understand what will be the way forward and what will be the directions in terms of the different countries involved. We've seen the US also pointing towards what needs to be done and how imperative it is for peace in Syria. And then, of course, with reference to what is going on in the country, there's also meetings that have held with Turkey in reference to whether or not there is going to be support in terms of the current situation. And we've seen that Turkey has extended that and has spoken about how this is something that is going to be put forward by the country, which will continue to fight the rebels within Syria. And so this is important, particularly in terms of the larger regional threats and concerns that these countries might have. And then, of course, how the US speaks about peace is imperative in the region. So we're going to be taking a look at what that means in terms of actual relations on ground and what will be the future of the people of Syria. Our next segment is going to be taking a look at what is going on in Pakistan, of course, with reference to the neighborhood. We've spoken about how the Afghan interim government in Afghanistan is providing safe havens to the Afghan, the kind of existence of radical groups and terrorist groups within Afghanistan. And of course, that includes the TTP, which has safe havens in Afghanistan, something that Pakistan has reiterated time and again in terms of protecting the country and against any, of course, other threat emerging from across the border. But what really will be the future stance of that actually taking place, and whether or not there are going to be countries or international community understanding what has been spoken in the United Nations by Pakistan's permanent representative yesterday with reference to how this is something that poses a regional and global threat and how the TTP can emerge as Al-Qaeda's arm. And so this is important, particularly in terms of how the international community views not just the threat that Pakistan faces on a daily basis, but also how it views a stable and peaceful Afghanistan and what can be done about that. So that's going to be our focus in the second segment of the show today. For this and more, as always, in the studios, I've been joined by senior analyst Farrukh Pitafi and Raja Faisal, and we've also been joined online by Professor Scott Lucas, who's a political analyst. Thank you very much, Professor Scott, for joining us and being a part of the discussion today. And I'll start with you in terms of what we've seen happening in Syria and how we are looking at the evolving situation. And while, of course, it is the end of Bashar al-Assad's regime and we see a potential hope for change in the place, I want your perspective on the matter in terms of how difficult that can possibly be in terms of the kind of international players that have been involved within this conflict for quite some time, and how historically we've seen that these transitions, of course, are very, very rare in terms of being a smooth process, in terms of being a peaceful process, or in terms of being a democratic process. So what do we currently see happening in Syria?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd prefer to start with Syrians themselves.
Sure, go ahead.
And to analyze that in part because what I've heard from my Syrian friends, and I'm fortunate to have many of them from who live inside the country or who have been displaced and are outside the country hoping to return, is this is a moment of hope. This is a moment that after hundreds of thousands being killed, after more than 11 million displaced, that many Syrians can finally get the chance to have a life with security, to have a life where they can pursue jobs, they can pursue education, they can pursue communities and not be under repression and threat of death. And although it is early days, I think it's important to give them that hope, because there are a lot of people around the world saying, oh no, it will fall to extremism, it will fall to terrorism, it will fall apart to factionalism. And in fact, what we've seen in the first couple of weeks is that this has been relatively peaceful, and that indeed the mass celebrations across Syria after Friday prayers, drawing in tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, are a marker, I think, of that possibility of a new Syria. Where does the international community fit into this? I would begin with this. I think the United States is off to the side. I think the United States is important when it comes to what happens with the future of the Kurdish area in northeast Syria. But I think far more important, in the other areas of Syria, are going to be Turkey's links with those rebel groups who overthrew the Assad regime. I think what will be important is whether Israel is going to try to destabilize the new Syria by expanding that zone of occupation that it has in the south of the country, and by continuing to carry out a series of airstrikes. And I think it will be important to watch how far Russia and Iran have, in effect, been knocked out, have been pushed out of the country with the defeat of their ally Assad.
Right, absolutely. And Faisal, we've spoken about this earlier as well, and I want your perspective in terms of what we have seen with regards to, of course, the U.S. presidency in place and how we were talking about the approach that is going to exist. We have the Secretary of State making his comments with regards to fighting the rebel forces within Syria, and of course Turkey has put forward its own stance. But what does that mean then in terms of staying out of this situation? It doesn't seem like that is the case.
Yeah, of course. So now, obviously, when we talk about American stance on Syria and the developments of Syria right now, of course, there is one thing is for sure that they want to, of course, carry out all of the activities against ISIS itself. And when it comes to Biden regime, this is the stance of Biden itself. We need to obviously wait for the moment when the Oval Office gets occupied by the President Trump in coming days, and what kind of stance he's going to have. That would matter the most, because we are looking at 4 consecutive years of his term coming up very soon. When it comes to Middle East overall, one thing is for sure that this shift in Syria and people like Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, he, of course, having his past with Al-Qaeda, his past with ISIS itself, and then not forgetting that his deputy was actually murdered a couple of months ago by ISIS itself in an IED attack, and this shows that he is not at good terms with ISIS itself. And when it comes to his support bank, of course, is Turkey itself. We know that Turkish intelligence is completely intact with Al-Jolani and his fighters as well. To me, of course, in coming days, when it was just about Idlib was a small area, of course, in which they were governing very well, reason being only their kind of people were there. When we talk about the whole Syria, of course, we have Kurds to look after, we have Alawites to look after, we have Shia Syrians to look after. So overall, it is going to be entirely a different ball game. They will be fighting against Kurds, they would be fighting against ISIS itself, and at the same time there would be intrusions from Iraqi side in terms of Shia fighters as well. So they will be very busy. At the same time, as it has been mentioned earlier, that Israeli forces, they have gone in, and of course sources tell that Mount Hermon, which happens to be the highest point in Syria itself, and it is only 44 to 45 kilometers away from Damascus itself. It means that the presence of artillery barrages of Israelis in at that point, of course, it is quite significant, and the buffer zone which was considered in past, that was of course right next to Golan Heights itself, and Golan Heights, of course, it was with Israel before, and now Israel's penetration is deep inside towards the Damascus side. Not Damascus itself, but all of the western side of Syria. Of course, it is under the nib of Israeli military. So in this whole context, Al-Jolani would be fighting here and there, east and west, in the center, everywhere. So to me, it looks like Idlib was quite easy for them to manage. But the mayor of Idlib, now when he becomes Prime Minister of Syria, declared Prime Minister of Syria by Al-Jolani, it would be a very tough job for him. The only hub of deep power we will be seeing in terms the support base of Al-Jolani, that is Turkish intelligence and Turkey itself, and for how long it is going to be extended to Al-Julani, that's what is going to be crucial in coming years. But so far, one thing is for sure, American regime and Turkey's regime, they are on the same page. Of course, they want to both of them counter ISIS itself. ISIS is a more dangerous phenomenon for Middle East and the adjacent all of the countries. So to me, I think it is going to be the same page for both of the countries. But when it comes to infightings and how to fight them out and how to shape up different zones and different sort of areas of Syria itself, that is going to be decided in future months and years. But one very important thing which I have been highlighting before as well, and I want to highlight it again, that if there is a fragile Syria and infighting is going on, then that would mean that the American forces in Middle East, they have a longer time to stay, as it has been in past, it was being sort of said that they might leave as soon as Trump comes into the office. But when now Trump comes into office, there are so many sensitivities in the Middle East itself, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE and Bahrain, all of these countries having very good relations and alliance type of relations with the Americans. To me, I think Americans won't be leaving the region as quickly as it was being said before. Reason being, if there is a volatile region and a country like Syria, and then of course it would affect so much so towards Iraq as well, with these two countries going jittery, I don't see Americans going out of the region so quickly, and it would ultimately mean that all of the countries I've been referring to, Middle Eastern countries, they will be feeling safe as well, and at the same time Israel itself would be feeling more safer in terms that they have the backup only an arm's length away.
Right, and this is something I want to explore further, Farrukh, in terms of what that role would look like, and particularly when we take a look at these threats and the kind of scenarios that we see emerging in the Middle East, of course, with reference to, in particular, to Syria. It seems that there is also concern with regards to forces like the IS and others, and there is also then concern in terms of what that involvement will look like on the ground. And we've seen that it wasn't something that we saw previously as well in Bashar al-Assad's regime as well, that there was a lot of proxy involvement. But in terms of what the situation is at the moment, what does that look like in terms of how the US or Turkey or even countries like Russia are going to actually have the kind of presence on ground?
Right. Thank you very much, Sana. I hate to dampen anybody's enthusiasm or optimism, but my humble submission is that you have to look at reality the way it is. A part of a dog's life is to actually chase the buses. The implicit truth is that they never get to actually get a hold of them. But now, if a dog has actually caught the bus, we still have to wait and see what exactly becomes of the bus, right? So far, what we have seen is, when you talk about the previous regime in Syria, one thing was for sure: it was brutal, it was horrible, but the fact is, it had a standing army. Standing armies don't only have people on ground; they fly planes. They also are supposed to have navies. So usually they defend the borders of the countries from external aggression as much as possible. Now what we are seeing is that the army that was there is being dismantled, and the way Israel has actually moved into Syria, that actually shows you what exactly is going on. We are not seeing the dissolution of a regime, we are actually seeing the dissolution of a state. And regardless of what becomes of the next government, it will take eons to actually build a new army, a navy, air force, and these guys actually who are actually ruling Syria now, They don't know how to fly planes. I haven't seen any example of them having that kind of capacity. So what is happening now? All the neighbors, especially the aggressive ones, are trying to carve out their sphere of influence. Israel is a practical kinetic example. Turkey, of course, has more influence with the new ruling elite. So that is something that is there. Now, to think that things are hunky-dory and this is a moment of hope is to overstate the reality. Because who actually comes on the street dancing and celebrating? The people who definitely think that there is some kind of victory to celebrate. But what about the people who were fighting on the other side? They must be hiding. So the cameras, I cannot actually capture them. And by the way, if I were to actually expect some kind of little mercies from Western media, I would have expected that they would be showing realities on ground in Gaza. They don't seem to be worried about that at all. It is Al Jazeera's responsibility or social media to actually show those pictures. Israel is involved here as well. So do you expect the media to be truthful? I don't think so. In that state of affairs, what happens next? My concern is that between two cases, the whole reality unravels. One is Afghanistan, where the US actually withdrew. At that time also there were celebrations, but because it was US that was withdrawing, Western media had to actually show it in a very different light. Had it been Russia, I'm sure that similar jubilation would have been shown. But what became of the regime there? In Afghanistan, things are bad, people are suffering, civil liberties have gone out of the window. And then when you talk about, the rulers don't have the kind of imagination that is needed to govern the country. Now, what is happening in Syria? You can say that Jilani might have some kind of creative vision, given that his mayor actually ruled Idlib for some time. But I don't think that we should hold our breath. These people are torn from the same cloth. No matter how they present themselves, they are extremists and they are going to continue to actually marginalize the opposition groups. They might say something to the other effect, but that won't save anything. I think in the end, we are heading towards greater Israel every day. Another country actually falls apart, and then it is Israel that actually steps in and increases its space, its labor realm, so to speak, living space. I'm sorry, I'm borrowing a term from Nazis, but you have to realize when you are imitating their methods, you are doing something similar. So in these state of affairs, I don't see any hope at all. I think that people of, by the way, there's one aspect, one silver lining in the clouds, and that is when two sides are fighting. If one side actually vanquishes the other, at least you know that there is not going to be much fighting that will go on. We still have to wait and see how the countries that seem to have actually given up on Syria, particularly Russia and Iran, what exactly is their end game. It was surprise to me that Russia kind of sort of had forsaken Syria in such a manner. It could be some kind of consolidation of power. They don't want to actually overextend, or they could be waiting for Donald Trump to take over government. But then there can be a pushback. In that situation, once again, we might be seeing a bloody mess at our hands.
Right. Professor Scott, I want your perspective on that as well. And given, of course, the way that we have seen the genocide continue in Palestine as well, and of course, the situation in Israel, and then how this is spreading over in Middle East. We've seen, of course, that this is something that has destabilized the region. There's a lot of concern in terms of what is happening. But we've seen that despite what has been going on and has been documented on social media and has been put forward, and the international community has taken note of, the genocide of course continues. And so we understand that with whatever news coming in, there is no real consequence that's happening. So with regards to Syria also, and with regards to the evolving situation then in the Middle East and in particular in Palestine as well, while we've seen that there is no real change in terms of whatever might happen, what will it take in terms of any sort of positive development to take place? Even if we talk about people from within Syria, the larger context remains that the power dynamics will always guide the decision-making process.
You know, I would be happy to discuss Gaza, where there is nothing positive, with you on another program. But I started this conversation by saying, from Syrians with whom I've been in touch, don't condemn them to hopelessness by saying this will be a failure, that it will be extremism and discord in that. You know, that's how I started. So I have to come back to that and say, if you want something positive from the start is that a leadership, a family leadership, which had terrorized many Syrians for more than a half century, which since 2011 had killed hundreds of thousands of them and displaced more than half the Syrians in the country, more than half the population. That family leadership is gone. It was swept aside within 12 days. That's positive. I mean, that is positive because it gives Syrians a chance. Now, what is that chance? Well, here I'm going to start off with some fundamentals that we can discuss. First of all, Syria is not Afghanistan. Syria is a very different country in terms of the background of its population. It's a very different country in terms of the social nature of the population, in terms of the education of the population, in terms of their position versus other countries than Afghanistan. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is not the Taliban. And indeed, the rebellion that finally ousted the Assad regime is not just Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Mr. al-Jilani. There are many groups who are involved, military groups, political groups, civil society groups. So let us start with what is happening now. And what is happening now is that the incoming authorities have called for respect of all minorities. Now, you may say that may not last. You may say that, but at this point, it is what is in place at this point. We have not seen sectarian violence since the liberation. And we did. And you know, your experts there, and they're wonderful experts, they say, well, what about the other side? We have seen the other side. We have seen those who have been in regime areas, who have not been attacked, who have come out on the streets. We have only had individual acts of violence, and those have tended to be against those who were well connected with the Assad regime, who were responsible for mass killings. For example, the individual in Western Syria connected with the Assad regime who killed more than 200 detainees and fed bits of them to his pet lion. That's the type of violence we've seen on an individual basis. But at this point overall, as this government is being established, the utilities are running, the businesses are open, transport is running. And while we have key issues ahead of us, and I think two are important to be very practical, and it's not the Islamic State. It is the question about whether Turkey is going to push its groups that it supports to attack the Kurds in northeast Syria, and it's going to be whether the Israelis try to expand their territory in Syria. While we watch those, and those are real threats, you know, to actually say that all of Syria is going to fall apart at the very outset, I don't think that's responsible analysis at this point. I think we have to be very cautious and very wary, but also not simply be doom mongering, because that's just not, that doesn't do respect to all those Syrians who want to have a chance.
Right, and this of course is important also in terms of our discussion ahead, and I want your perspective on Afghanistan too. And you just mentioned how these two countries are different, but I want your take on what has been going on since the Afghan Taliban regime of course has existed, and we of course from a Pakistani perspective have our own concerns and viewpoints, but I'll come to that later. I want that larger context also in terms of how Afghanistan is different at the moment, and also in terms of the way that the international community views threats emerging from from outside of Afghanistan is any concern for them also, because in a lot of ways we want to understand whether or not there is that international approach of these countries, or concerned that it is a direct threat in any way to the region or to the globe, and not just for countries like Pakistan.
Yeah, again, we could take a long time to discuss what happened in Afghanistan since the start of the 21st century. But the starting point is that you never established effective governance in the country. You never established a government which, let's say, was not economically challenged, where a lot of money went missing. You never established a government that delivered services across all of Afghanistan. You never really established effective security forces in many parts of the country. And that was a failure in which there were many culprits. Many of those who intervened in Afghanistan simply did not provide that effective, as it were, support at the end of the day for a national system. And of course, it was the fault of those who claimed to lead Afghanistan, who at the end of the day were exposed as being deficient. The Taliban, and we can certainly criticize the Taliban on many fronts, and I do so. But the Taliban at the end of the day showed that they were an authority that could take control and be supported by some Afghans to impose some measure of what they would consider security, even as they abused and curtailed rights for many within the country. But that's not the dynamic in Syria. Syria is a very different case. Syria is a different case in the sense that you had a number of groups of Syrians in the south as well as in the north, who in many cases were maintaining the opposition to Assad while the US retreated, while many in the international community retreated, and while they failed to protect civilians. The one exception to that was Turkey. Those groups have had years of running their own area up in northwest Syria, as well as trying to mobilize the forces, which they did in the last few weeks, but which they did plan for more than a year, to take power in Damascus. So there's an internal development in Syria amongst these factions who were able to unify themselves. That's very different from the Taliban and their history in Afghanistan. And the question here is, as the studio was raised, is will those groups who have come together in Syria, will they be able to work together in government? And that has to start from within. That cannot start from outside, even if the two big backers of that attempt to establish a government were going to be Turkey and Qatar.
Right, absolutely. And Faisal, I want your perspective on this too, because when we talk about this particular threat emerging from Afghanistan, it's important to understand the dynamic from a Pakistan perspective as well. And it's important, of course, to understand that we have made these calls a number of times now in terms of the AIG to protect their soil being used against any other territory, including Pakistan, in terms of course, making these calls and efforts to ensure that the safe havens are not provided, that there is no threat emerging for the country, and that, of course, organizations such as the TTP also don't find space there. But in terms of what Pakistan has been facing and the calls that have been made, we have, of course, not seen the kind of response that one would hope for. And in that sense, at this moment, what will be the way forward with reference to what the permanent representative to the UN for Pakistan has also stated, that the TTP can emerge as Al-Qaeda's arm, and so does that in any way, or the potential that exists in this reference, in any way change the dynamics between Pakistan and Afghanistan, also between the way that countries look at Afghanistan?
Yes, Anna, that's a very good question, and I think at this hour, Pakistan mentioning this factor, the TTP factor, and the kind of relations they have with ISIS Khorasan as well, I think it was pivotal, and it is important in the context that if the world was concerned about Al-Qaeda, concerned about ISIS in past, then are they concerned still or not? If they are not concerned, then of course, it leaves up to Pakistan and it leaves up to the neighboring countries of Afghanistan to deal with it. But I think it was a good step forward to at least highlight it so that we can remind the world once more that if they were against Al-Qaeda and if Al-Qaeda was posing a threat to the whole world, especially the Western world, as we know that there were bombings take place in London, bombings take place in Europe elsewhere, including of course Spain, and then the whole world was being affected by that. At that time, if they were a threat to them, why not ISIS Khorasan is a threat now? Why not TTP is a threat right now? Because they are in the larger in number and they are of course there to be taken by anyone. If the easy investments made to them, it would create a havoc not only for Pakistan, not only for the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, but once more for the whole world, I must say. Reason being, we shouldn't be forgetting that Afghanistan's volatile region with Pakistan's borders, 3 provinces, Nuristan, Nangarhar, Kunnad, they were used in past to breed terrorists to send in the Western countries and of course affect the whole world. Now is the chance. Pakistan has been fighting against this war. It is understandable for the West. War in Afghanistan ended long ago. When it comes to America, war ended in 2020. But when it comes to Pakistan, Pakistan has been fighting since a long time. Pakistan still is fighting day and night to secure Pakistan, and I must say it's not only Pakistan saving Pakistan, but of course Pakistan is saving the whole world in an environment where we know that terrorism gets breeded there, and the job which should have been carried out by Taliban themselves as they pledged in Doha Accord, that they will never be letting their land to be used against any of the neighboring countries or elsewhere in the world. They will stop this phenomenon of exporting terrorism from Afghanistan. If they are not doing it, if they are not in compliance to their own words, then of course Pakistan is making sure to do every bit to safeguard the world and Pakistan as well at the same time. I must say the recent attack in which one of their own ministers got eliminated by ISIS Khorasan, this is another message for Taliban themselves, Taliban regime themselves, that this is the time that they should be taking seriously the demands which were being Pakistan was making in terms that they have to do something about TTP, because the larger number of TTP, of course they are hand in glove with ISIS Khorasan, and time is not far that as they had relations with Al-Qaeda in past, once more simply they were doing the same what they were doing in past. So if they do the same, then suddenly we would see the West waking up as well and coming to Pakistan and of course trying to sort it out. Why not do it now? Why wait for the time when something happens?
What do you mean when you say coming to Pakistan and sorting it out?
Of course Pakistan is actively fighting against this menace. So Pakistan is the only country that is fighting against this menace. I mean, rest of all countries, they simply said, it is of no concern to them, as once Hillary Clinton herself said that we made the biggest mistake when we left Taliban, when we left Mujahideen, when we left Stinger missiles in the hands of these Mujahideens, and we said to ISI, you deal with it, you carry on with whatever you're doing, and we just simply ran away from there. Now is the time that they have to realize that if they want to fix something forever, then do it rightly, not leave the place, not leave a problem all scattered around. I mean, they have to of course join hands with Pakistan and fight this menace.
And Farrukh, I want your perspective on that, particularly in terms of what that entails also, and whether or not this concern that Pakistan has can actually be something that we can take a look at in terms of the international sense. And we spoke about this yesterday also in terms of how our own borders, of course, need to be secure, our own people need to be secure. It's a direct threat to, of course, our country and what has been going on. And so how much of that chunk then can we really look towards international forces in helping us deal with?
Right, Sana, thank you very much. This is an important question and one we keep on struggling with every day.
Yeah.
But with your permission, I want to take a step back and connect with what Dr. Lucas was saying. And I just want to actually highlight, I think my critique was taken negatively. It wasn't, I really respect his opinion. My problem is with something else, and that is Western media and Western governments. Right? And you have to actually highlight what is going on. For example, Doctor was actually talking about a comparison between Syria and Afghanistan. Look at the situation on ground, and you have to realize that the only difference is Afghanistan is a few steps ahead in its descent into chaos. If you want to actually look at today's Syria, you can compare it with what was happening back in 1989 when the Soviet Union had actually withdrawn, and at that time there was an atrocious government, and then there were other militant parties that were trying to take over. At that time, similar kind of situation was taking place. At that time, there were too many cooks around the country. Similarly, there are too many cooks around Syria also. What is going to happen to Turkey today? It might be very happy with whatever it has got. I think it should learn from Pakistan's experience in 1989 because similar kind of situation was there. And unfortunately, now the situation in Afghanistan is such that there doesn't seem to be any correction possible. And this is my frustration. All we can do is harden our borders and secure Pakistan's own territories and not worry about what happens in Afghanistan. Otherwise, it will be utter chaos. In Syria, the biggest problem, and you have to realize where I come from. I'm not saying that this group is bad or that group is good. My humble submission is I am a secular man. I believe in secular democracy, and I want secular democracy with proper borders and securities for all the countries. When that is not happening, human beings suffer. I respect Syrians who are actually celebrating, and I know how brutal the Assad regime was. But the problem, and this time we have to actually now move to the US to actually see something that has happened. The victory of Donald Trump shows that the counterculture in America is totally unhinged, and it seems to be disrespecting two institutions. One, the government, second, the media. And because of that, on one side, they have elected with so much power a billionaire, populist billionaire, and then they are also celebrating the murder of a CEO at the hands of Luigi, whatever his last name is, very hard to pronounce. But this is because these institutions have not done their job. They haven't been very honest. In Iraq's invasion, they were not honest. So many other places. So now people don't trust these institutions. And when I point out that they are dropping ball, my humble submission is not that they should be retired or overlooked. My humble submission is try better, try harder. Because right now, if people lose trust in objectivity of these institutions, then all over the world, you are going to have raw chaos. Remember that in the past, we have seen these excitable moments when in Egypt, there was Arab Spring, and we saw Mohammad Mursi coming to power. What became of that system? Now, once again, Egypt is a dictatorship. Similarly, in Afghanistan, there were celebrations back in 1989, 2000s, and then later on in 2020s also. But what happens then? People should not be treated as part of some kind of human waste. They are not human beings. They are entitled to all the rights. So that holds true for Afghanistan, that holds true for Gaza, that holds true for Syria.
Absolutely, and this is absolutely essential in any move forward. And Professor Scott, I'd like you to respond to that also, but add to that, since we're short on time, in terms of what the future holds for the ways in which that we can understand these situations and these conflicts. And while we talk a lot about collaboration on defense cooperations and collaboration on war against terrorism and fighting all the terrorist groups and conflicts everywhere, we see that despite that, whatever happens on ground is governed by different dynamics. And so for Pakistan, of course, the priority is to protect our own country and our own citizens, as it is for any other country. But in terms of the situation in Afghanistan, are there any real efforts moving towards a peaceful and stable Afghanistan, despite the fact that we have the AIG in place? Because while, of course, it's not what it had committed to do or what it had promised to do, and of course, in no way is at a position where it can be recognized, but it is by default what is in power at the moment, and there are real people who are suffering at their hands.
I think, your experts have summarized it quite well in saying that at this point, with respect to Afghanistan, it's the Taliban that oversee the institutions. There really is no alternative at this point. We can explain how it came to this point, how, in terms of intervening in Afghanistan, indeed, some countries actually helped the Taliban for many years, helped put them in that position before turning against them. Now it's the case that you can't really intervene in Afghanistan to try to change those institutions. I don't think it would work. I think the most you can do is maintain contacts with Afghans to try to support international efforts for assistance to Afghans when that is possible, and indeed to protect your security against those threats that may come out of Afghanistan, such as the Islamic State. The reason why I push back about saying Syria is not Afghanistan, and indeed Gaza is not Afghanistan, is because of those two very different cases in terms about institutions, that very important point that was made. There are no institutions in Gaza left anymore. They have been obliterated by the Israelis. It is going to take years, probably decades, to get a semblance of humanity, let alone functioning institutions in that area. But we have that prospect in Syria. For all the different backgrounds of the groups that we've talked about there, they will be embarking in the next few weeks and months to reestablish institutions, to establish institutions for security, to establish financial institutions, economic institutions, and yes, diplomatic institutions. They will not simply be puppets of the Turks or of Gulf states. They will not simply be hostages of Israel. So as much as you can make connections with those Syrians who are trying to rebuild those institutions, including from Pakistan, in a cooperative basis, that's the way out of this mess that we've seen in other countries that we've been describing in the past 45 minutes.
Right, absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor Scott Lucas, for joining us and being a part of the debate today. Thank you, Farrukh, and thank you, Faisal, for joining us as always. That's all that we have time for, and we'll now see you on Monday.